Started.
Hi, I see that some of you all are joining us, and we'll wait till a few more participants are on, and then we'll say some hellos and get going. I see that we have a lot of our participants on, and I'll give it just a second or two more as we get a few more online with us, and then we'll start up. It looks like we might have most people with us now, so I just would like to start by thanking you all for joining us today. I think we're going to have a very interesting video discussion. I'm Tom Saunders. I'm President and CEO of the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, and we miss being able to get together with you all in person. We do a little of that still, distantly and safe, but we are glad that we have the technology that we can still gather by Zoom and Teams and do events like this. So we have a very interesting topic today. Our topic today is conservation in a changing climate. And I think most of the people on this video call are familiar with the Conservancy, but for any of you who are not terribly familiar, we have a number of different work areas, program areas. We do land conservation work. We enhance and restore rivers and streams across Western Pennsylvania. We work to protect rare and threatened species and their habitats. And we do urban forestry work and gardens work. And in all those different conservation program areas, an issue that we deal with every day in every single program is climate change. And while we have a lot of experts across the Conservancy who are grappling with those issues and helping to guide our work in relation to climate change, one of our very best experts on that is with us today to lead our talk, and that is Charles Bier, who is our Senior Director of Conservation Science. So Charles, with that introduction, it looks like we have just about everyone on at this point, and I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Tom. There's a lot to share today, so I think I'm just going to move right ahead into it. And I would like to use this initial photograph of Olive May, who attended a climate science march a few years ago, just using her sign here to indicate we're not going to discuss today whether there is climate change or not. We're just going to take that as a given and then move on and talk about what it means to the landscape around us, the flora and the fauna, and then eventually, especially to conservation that we're involved with. So just a quick review, just to get us all on the same page. I think you all know climate change is related to the atmosphere and to gases in the atmosphere. Those gases are a variety. Carbon dioxide is one that gets talked about a lot. It's one of the more common ones and one of the ones that has been added to the atmosphere in recent years and has been causing climate change. The climate does change. Usually it's slowly. That's a natural phenomenon. And the real issue these days is that it's changing very quickly. And not only is it something that is causing us some consternation in trying to react to it and will continue to, but also the ecosystems around us are facing a climate that's changing much more rapidly than it has in most of Earth's history in the past. So the climate really, scientists tell us it's been changing for a while, and decades at least, since the middle of the last century, because we've been loading the atmosphere with greenhouse gases for a century and a half or more. When I learned about climate change, I learned about it as the greenhouse effect, and that was when I was a freshman in environmental sciences in high school. And I kind of tucked that away and didn't think too much about it after that. But then in hindsight now, I believe I experienced the results of climate change in some later years. I was conducting a breeding bird census study during a college summer while I was working for the Audubon Society. And in the Buffalo Creek Valley, I had a transect of 1,000 meters or so where I was recording, largely by ear, the birds that were nesting in this valley. I did this along an abandoned railroad. This was in 1975. I had studied birds for a number of years and was fairly adept at identifying all of not only the songs that were important to breeding birds, but also the different calls. And one morning in June, I heard a song that I had not heard before and I couldn't identify. And it took me a while actually to locate the bird. And it ended up being a yellow-throated warbler, which was totally unexpected. And on the left side of this slide, you can see the map of the range of the yellow-throated warbler at that time, based on data from the early and mid 1900s. And you can see that the range really was not in Pennsylvania, or even for the most part close to it. But I found that bird, and it actually returned the next year. It was probably nesting there and did not find a nest. And in subsequent years, this species was expanding. And so in the 1980s, the Pennsylvania Breeding Bird Atlas Project was started. There were 2 atlas projects that were conducted between 1983 and 2009. And you can see in the other map here, a dot map, all of the locations where the yellow-throated warbler has been discovered. So this is obviously a species that has expanded its range. It's a southern species. The question is, what was happening there? Why was this taking place? Turns out the yellow-throated warbler is not the only bird that has expanded its range. Here are a number of other southern birds that have expanded their range into Pennsylvania. Some of them were in Pennsylvania, but have become much more common. So is this all the result of a warming climate? Another bit of evidence about climate change, a warming climate, global warming, is that the US Department of Agriculture changed their zone map for the plant hardiness growing zones in 2012. So parts of Pennsylvania flipped into different zones and are now included in zones that indicate it's a warmer area, with the frosts coming later in the autumn and also ending earlier in the spring. These are all correlations. They don't necessarily indicate that's what the cause is, but the scientists really are telling us that all of these things are fitting together with the warming climate. So those major trends then include that there are predictions, and I think it's important we have to go with predictions and try to look ahead to see what we're going to be facing. And some of this is known with a better sense than other parts of it. Here's a map done by the Union of Concerned Scientists kind of projecting, and this is for Eastern Pennsylvania, depending on how well we get a hold of our emissions of greenhouse gases, what Eastern Pennsylvania will be like in the future. And you can see that under the worst case scenario, at the end of this century, this will be similar to southeastern Georgia. Out of the 10 hottest years on record for the Earth, those have occurred since 1998. So all of these are trends that indicate the issues that we're now facing. Another big one that I think is important, it's certainly important for conservation and also for human systems, is the global water budget. So a lot of ice is melting. I think you've all heard about this, and not only are the seas rising, but an issue that we're also facing, and of course here in Pennsylvania we don't have to be too concerned directly with rising sea levels, but the whole water budget is increasing. So all of the aspects of water on the Earth are changing, and the water cycle is being loaded up with more and more water. And this is possible because also the climate is getting warmer. So as the atmosphere and the land is warming, it's able to drive all this water through the various cycles, and that's creating increases in rainfall, potentially snowfall, also water vapor in the air, which can be important in a number of ways. So 2018 was the wettest year on record in many parts of Pennsylvania. 2019 was also fairly wet. It was the wettest year on record in general for the nation. And then this year, in some areas of Pennsylvania, we're experiencing a drought. So that's sort of strange. But another term that's been used for climate change or global warming is global weirding. And so there are patterns to weather that are describing a new climate that are totally strange to us. And so some of you may remember the polar vortex of 2010 in January. Lots of snow was dumped, and people look at this and think, well, how could there be climate change? Well, this is actually believed to be exactly an example of climate change, because again, all of that water loaded into the water budget, and then we have an unstable jet stream, which is the air that circulates around the southern margins of the pole, which is becoming unstable and creates some very strange weather patterns for us over time, and can create things like sudden snowfalls or rain systems that hold in place and dump huge amounts of water in one location. So the jet stream is kind of a strange aspect. It's not something you might think of when you think of climate change, but due to the warming of the Arctic, the stream becomes unstable and starts to dip down, and it has lobes that go way to the south, and at times it can even break up because it's become so unstable. So it's something you might want to learn more about. So how do all of these things influence biodiversity? Some of those things, we've been talking about now: the increased temperatures, higher precipitation. That precipitation's coming in really energy intense events. So lots of flash flooding is possible. Things are getting wetter, occasional heavy snow falls, but also with the jet stream being unpredictable, we can have drought periods. The streams are also warming up. This reduces the amount of oxygen, which makes it difficult for aquatic life Aquatic systems can also become more acidic due to the carbon dioxide. And I have down here that the autumn colors can be reduced. You might think, well, what does that have to do with, ecosystems? But during exceptionally wet years, the trees get stressed, so they're not as colorful. We see that, but they're feeling the effects of some of these aspects of climate change. And the species have certainly dealt with a changing climate over time. It's just, again, the rapidity of what's happening right now that makes it very difficult, and the excessiveness. So temperatures can go beyond the parameters that species are able to tolerate. Precipitation can do the same thing and either be too much or too little. And all of this, of course, you may have heard, relates to species trying to respond to these situations where their environment is now has aspects of it that are beyond their tolerances, and they try to move, and they need to move, but they try to immigrate in a landscape that may have issues, often human created issues like fragmentation or barriers that make it difficult. We'll talk a little bit more about the flash flooding, but then kind of an example of an insidious nature of the climate changing is this idea that there are mismatches now sometimes between species that are dependent upon each other. This has especially been pointed out with some research in Europe, where birds migrating back actually get back from their wintering grounds onto their breeding grounds to the north. And when they arrive, they find out that they followed their biological clock and they got there at the right time, but the landscape was so warm that the insects, which make up the majority of the food that they need for nesting, the insects have already emerged and maybe past their prime as a food source. We mentioned the more intense flooding, and there are lots of what we call benthic invertebrates that live in the bottom of streams, and these can just be churned up and washed away or washed downstream. This makes it very difficult for species such as this yellow lamp mussel that you can see in the stream to stay rooted. It's not as hard for the adult mussels to stay there as it is for the juveniles, which are very small initially. Even animals trying to hibernate, like wood turtles hibernate in the banks of streams, they potentially can be washed out, and this is just detrimental to a number of life forms. Evidence of this also, back just for a moment to the human side of things, is that there's more money being lost and paid out in flood insurance programs. So to really get a sense of what this all means or how it affects plants and animals, we need to just visit what it is that governs species and where they live, and then we can figure out, how this might be affecting them. So here's a list of things that that govern where species are found. A number of these, of course, are affected by climate, temperature and precipitation, certainly. And then I also suggested the obligate relationships between for example, birds and the insects that they use to nest, to feed their young. Those are relationships that can be disrupted by climate. Some of these patterns, for example, were determined by Hart Merriam back in the 1880s. He studied mountains in Arizona, and he came up with this concept of different biomes. As you go up in elevation, you find that the ecosystems change, and this is largely due to temperature, also available water vapor, precipitation, condensation. And so there's this very basic pattern of ecology that he was able to discover. We also note the same pattern occurs on a continental scale. On the left there, you can see North America and the arrow indicating that as you go north, it of course gets cooler, colder, precipitation changes. And this is a pattern that's important because as the climate changes, species tend to, again, react. They need to keep within the tolerance of what they can tolerate in terms of temperature, precipitation, and other factors. So they tend to want to move. And so we're seeing that species are moving up in elevation and also to the north. And where is this going to lead? Here is a chart of some of the trees in Pennsylvania, and this is research that was done through Penn State modeling, trying to predict where are the trees going to be in the future. And what these different color bars indicate is that some of the species, like those at the top, are predicted to potentially no longer be in Pennsylvania in the future. And it may take a century or two for this to happen, depending on all the factors. But it's predicted that the limits of tolerance on temperature and precipitation and so forth will go out of bounds for these species, and they will potentially no longer be in the state. As you go down the list, then the next grouping are species that might no longer be in Pennsylvania, and then at the very bottom, the darkest green are actually species we do not have in Pennsylvania right now that probably will immigrate, and Pennsylvania will have the conditions that are suitable for them to live. So here's a list, for example, out of that one. And out of these species that, these species are all part of ecosystems now, and they have value to many, many species of insects and birds, for example. Down at the bottom of the list is our state tree, and it's predicted that it potentially will become actually a rare species in the future. And then, of course, the black cherry is an economically, probably the most economically valuable tree in the state. On the flip side, species that will become more common or will move into the state, and here's a group of those. In addition to species moving into the state, there are also questions about species that are into the state and how will they fare during climate change. We have a number of species with the northern limit of range is right in Pennsylvania. Will these species be able to continue to move further north into Pennsylvania, or will there be any issues about their immigration? For example, the green salamander on the right there is found in Pennsylvania only in Fayette County and only south of the Youghiogheny River, as it is known presently. And the Youghiogheny River appears to be a range barrier for this species. So what is its future? Something else that really aggravates native species, of course, and what has been stated sometimes as the second factor to cause the decline or extinction of native species are non-native invasive species, and climate change seems to be favoring some of those and is predicted to allow them to be more aggressive in our environment. In the lower left there, kudzu, which is an oriental vine that has been very common in southern states for a long time is now in Pennsylvania. It's found in a couple different places, and in those places seems to be doing pretty well. So invasive species are potentially a real issue. The feral swine is a species that is of course not native anywhere in North America, but has been common in southern states. And in recent years, it appears that the northern climates that are kind of evolving are suitable for it to be moving north. And now it is up into Michigan and parts of southern Canada. So that's a little bit of a background. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about what the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, how our programs are interfacing with all of this. And basically, there's research going on, and then we're also trying to keep tabs on what many other researchers and conservation biologists are doing in order to take some action. Western Pennsylvania Conservancy is a partner in something called the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. This program, partnership with the Pennsylvania Game Commission, Fish and Boat Commission, and Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, is a group of scientists and data managers that collect information about the biodiversity of the state. And then that information is managed and used for conservation. There are a number of projects that have been underway to look at climate as the changes are occurring, trying to make assessments and predictions. The first one is the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. This is a desktop study to look at information that describes species, their life histories, and aspects of their biology that might be either vulnerable to climate change or maybe not. Maybe the changing climate will actually favor them. So what we have is a set of species, at least to date, 85 plants and animals that have been assessed. And you can see there in the yellow outline that there are scores given as to whether the species is believed to be vulnerable or not, based on, again, the different factors of its life history. And then this information can be used to try to manage, or at least to try to ask other questions and try to figure out if there are ways that the species can be assisted as we go through this period of the changing climate. Another project is looking at what are referred to as boreal refugia. These are places that are similar to much further north, and they're usually wetlands. These are peatlands, which means the soils in these wetlands consist of peat, and the scientists have set up plots, and they're trying to create a baseline of information to try to monitor these sites over time to see if they will be changing as the climate changes. Here you can see the areas that the red and the black splotches there are the high elevation peatland, and some of those, 30 of those were sites that have been studied now. Baseline has been created, and the scientists will go back to those sites and look at them in the future and try to get an assessment of just the health and the quality that's taking place. Another project is to look at rare wetland butterflies, and to look specifically at the conservation of those, what they seem to be sensitive to in their environment. This project was a multi-state project. You can see Maryland, New Jersey, and Delaware were also part of this. There were sites visited to collect more data about these species, And then looking at the precipitation, temperature, elevation, geology, and so forth, there are models that have been created trying to predict what's going to happen to particular species as the climate changes, because precipitation changes due to climate change or temperature. It may affect species like the bog copper, which is a wetland species that is an obligate feeder as a caterpillar on cranberry in the lower right there. And so there are predictions made as to where it might end up in the future, whether the range will contract or expand. The map there in the upper left is an example of another species, but the table there in the bar graph shows you that the bog copper is actually predicted to contract in Pennsylvania. So the sites where it does exist, those wetlands that are peatlands with cranberry, there aren't that many of them for the bog copper in the state, but it's predicted that those habitats will change to the extent that the bog copper, it will certainly not be as common and potentially will be gone from Pennsylvania in the future. A concept that's it's not new to climate change because of climate change biology, but one that's even more important now is this this idea that habitats need to be connected within the landscape. So there's a study that's been done across the state now looking at connectivity between habitats and the corridors or the connectors between those, whether they exist or not. These are pathways for movements because the species, again, will be wanting to move to get within their tolerance limits for things like temperature. And whether they face barriers or not is an important consideration. So the habitats, also referred to as hubs, are analyzed, and then the landscape around those is reviewed to see whether the landscape is basically permeable, whether the species can move through it easily to get to another patch of habitat. It's not good to have just one habitat area for a species, but certainly there's a higher viability when there are multiple habitats. So here is a schematic showing the orange and the dark green, which are the habitat hubs. And then the idea is that we need to have connectors such as in the light green, and they need to be functional connectors that will work to allow species to move through the landscape as the climate changes and as the places where they exist now no longer become suitable for their survival. So that's some of the science. And then, of course, being the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, we're a land trust. We protect a lot of land as much as we can. This talk is about biodiversity conservation, and there are other types of conservation, but today I hope you've gotten the sense that this one are really talking about the flora, the fauna, all the species and ecosystems that are out there. And ultimately, one of the missions of WPC is to protect those areas. We do it largely by protecting the land, by acquiring it, or by applying some sort of conservation tool to the land, like a conservation easement. So the question comes up, climate change, what are we going to do about it? Well, we don't have all the answers, but we're trying to come up with some. And we're, as I said before, we're plugging into a network of practitioners that are asking the same questions and facing the same dilemmas or the same challenges, or in some cases, the same opportunities, or trying to develop opportunities. And those are really at a national level that we're trying to plug into these things. So in terms of land protection, what we find when we look at climate change, some of the work is the same that we've been doing and we need to continue doing it, but in some cases we need to ramp up our efforts or increase certain aspects of what we do. So here you can see it's really the same work. Bigger is better. It makes the sites more resilient. I'll talk about that in a moment. Areas that are important need to have buffers around them so that the edges of those important areas don't go right into a landscape that's hostile to the habitat that we're trying to protect. Fragmentation is an issue. It's even a bigger issue now with climate change. So keeping the landscape as whole as possible without big swaths of inhabitable land in between habitats, providing the connections at various scales. I mentioned that. Yeah, keeping cold water cold is more and more important. Wider buffers on streams are going to help us do that. And we need to think more and more about the details of ecosystems and pay attention to these things called key ecological attributes. And these can be things even like pollination of the plants within an ecosystem or a habitat. Are there issues that are affecting pollinators? And is there something that we can learn and do about that? We have in the past prioritized our work. You can see the one bullet there by global biodiversity significance. And what that means is the rarest species, the most imperiled, the endangered ones. We often prioritize our work along those lines. That may be changing a little bit now, and I'll talk more about that. And creating redundancy is even more important with the changing climate because you can't put all your eggs in one basket. You need to have multiple examples of the same type of habitat or the same species population that the species might be endangered. You don't want to have just one example of that, but multiple ones. So forests for Pennsylvania are still best. And that becomes even more important in the changing climate and can take on other values as well, because in addition to trying to protect biodiversity, conservation can also have a dual goal of doing things like sequestering carbon with forests. So presently, Western Pennsylvania Conservancy owns over 14,000 acres, and almost that entire number is natural forest. We do have some sustainable forest acreage that's involved. So the new work. So because we're in a changing climate now, what does that mean to conservation? Well, we're investigating the need to actually work in different places than we have before. And some of those places have been underprotected in the past, and we may need to turn to those. The diversity of terrain can be much more important now because of resiliency. And we can use a test of resiliency, I'll talk about this in a moment, to actually assess some of our projects and to evaluate just how valuable, due to reasons of climate changing, a site is because it's more resilient. A higher diversity of things like soil types can be important because we are trying to rush to protect things, a variety of things. Some of those plants and animals we don't even know very well. They might not be very well present. There are actually lots of species in Pennsylvania that haven't even been discovered yet that are part of our ecosystems. We're finding that certain soil types and certain geologies are important to protect, and I'll talk more about that as well. And then there's this concept of protecting habitats and not species. Again, I will pick up on that. And then the connectivity I have mentioned, and that's going to become more and more important as species are looking for corridors to move largely from north to south, but sometimes from low to high. The new work also includes other concepts that we haven't really dealt with before, such as species translocation. So actually trying to help species. Some conservation biologists have been talking about actually moving species around if they can't get kind of out of the way of the increasing temperatures that are causing them to not be able to survive in their present locations. Should we actually move them because they can't move fast enough? Remember, this whole idea of the changing climate is happening so rapidly that species are really, we think, going to be unable to respond very well in a lot of cases. And I mentioned invasive species before. Those stresses now amplified. Is there something we need to do about the invasives? There are some other factors that are also out of the tolerance limits of those species, and just some of these issues are going to be very difficult for us to deal with, but we use the tools of land protection. Bigger is better, larger buffers. That's what we really have to call upon. There's also this question of, do we give up on places? Those boreal peatlands where the white-throated sparrow was living in that one photograph, and the bog copper and the cranberry, do we give up on those because there's nothing we can do? Well, we have a certain perspective on that. I'll talk about that in just a second. And then there's the issue of adaptation with our stewardship of lands, and that's a whole other topic that we probably would have to pick up at another time. I mentioned resiliency a couple times, and basically the idea is that we need to make sites tough, and we need to make them so that they can bounce back when they're afflicted with excessive drought, too much precipitation, invasive species, things like that. So we look for sites that are large, that are diverse, geologically, topographically, and by soil. They are well buffered, and they're connected through those corridors. This all makes sites resilient to changes, including changes that are coming due to the climate. So the newest concepts guiding, and some of these things I alluded to some of the earlier slides, but now let's talk about sort of some of these last concepts that I wanted to discuss today. And part of it's based on biogeography, and I find biogeography interesting, and it's basically pretty simple. It's just the patterns of distribution of life on Earth. And you know some of those patterns, even if you don't think you do, because you probably all know that penguins, for example, are totally a southern hemisphere group of species. So that's biogeography. That's the pattern of where they occur. And it's been predicted there are probably more than 25,000 species of living species in Pennsylvania. Each of these has a pattern of where it lives, its range, its use of the landscape, and so forth. For example, here are the two chickadees we have in Pennsylvania. They partition the state pretty well. The Carolina chickadee on the bottom, and the black-capped chickadee on the top. And the Carolina actually is moving north now. It's been shown to have moved. I can't remember exactly how far, but it is shown to be on the move. And again, this is likely climate. these two species are living, have been living where they're living for reasons. And again, that list that we looked at earlier with precipitation and temperature and what they eat and so forth have defined it in the past anyway. And these are all patterns that are important to at least try to understand. Here's some patterns of plants. And these are the natural ranges, for the most part, of plants that are found in Pennsylvania. And you can see these are all native species in Pennsylvania, but they certainly aren't found all across the state. And the sweet gum, for example, is a coastal plain species that naturally growing. Some of you may know this tree, only found down here in Pennsylvania. These outlier dots are where it has been planted, a few records. And then the painted trillium has this distribution, what we call the T distribution, of high elevation or to the north. So this is a species of largely cooler north or higher elevation habitats. And these are, again, patterns that are based on the pathways for these species to live, and these patterns exist for certain reasons, and they're important to try to understand. But what's probably more important is to actually look at the actual habitats that are supporting these species and understand exactly what those are. There was some work done by Mark Anderson in the Nature Conservancy, and we've been following this. And it's to try to look at these patterns of total biodiversity. Mark's work started looking at the whole Northeast. And what he found was, when he tried to look at the biodiversity and where it was, he found that it's based a lot on the geology or the bedrock that creates the soils that create habitats, as well as things like elevation and then also latitude. And that some of these, that you had to have essentially all of these different places in order to protect the biodiversity of the region. And so that's what all of these shadings indicate, is that there are different geologies and elevations that are creating different habitats that support the species that are found. And throughout the region, those patterns of distribution will be different based on those factors. And then he has a couple other different graphs here, but this one in particular is important for conservationists to pay attention to, because it indicates that for those different areas, here in the title you can see they're called settings, that some of those are more or less developed already or converted to other uses, such as agriculture or highways or whatever. And some of them are less converted. And the richness of these sites, or the importance to maintaining the total portfolio of biodiversity in the region, it's important to recognize the role each of these plays and the importance that they each hold. So there's this concept that I want you to think about, and it's called conserving the stage. And the idea, the parallel is that you could have stages in a theater, and you have actors, and the actors come and go on the stage, but the stage remains, and ultimately, largely unchanged. And the parallel is that perhaps with these big changes in the climate that are changing precipitation and temperature and ecosystems, that we pay attention to the stage or the place on the landscape, and we actually won't be able to pay attention as much to the species that are occupying those stages or those habitats, because we can't hold them in place. They will leave. So in Pennsylvania, what we're seeing is we can look at the geology of Pennsylvania in a much more detailed fashion than Mark Anderson was looking at throughout the region, and get a much more informed basis for some of this understanding. So here's the geology of Pennsylvania. Some of you might know Allegheny Front or Allegheny Mountain. This is the ridge where you go through the tunnel in the turnpike as you're going east. The first tunnel is in this ridge, and you can see the different colors here and how it changes so much as you move across the state. And each of these colors is a different geology. So these are different bedrocks, and they vary from sandstones to shales to limestones and so forth. And these are all the bases that that create habitats in the state. So as an example, and if we're going to protect all of biodiversity, we need to protect all of these sites. So there's an area down in south central Pennsylvania I call the shale country, and that's because Devonian shales make up the landscape there at the mid and lower elevations. And there are certain places in Bedford, Fulton, Huntington counties, for example, where you have very unique habitat types in places where some species live that don't live anywhere else. And here you can see that we actually have cactus in Pennsylvania. There's prickly pear cactus and Cates Mountain clover and cat's paw ragwort in the upper right. And those are all species that are only found in these unique shale habitats, very hot, dry, open areas that must be protected if we're going to protect numerous species of plants and animals that occupy those sites. Another example is the limestone communities in Pennsylvania. And here's an example of a plant, round-leaved ragwort on the left, and it's the sole food for the caterpillar of the northern meadowlark butterfly on the right. And so these species are linked. The meadowlark has to have the ragwort has to have limestone soils, and without that all working, those would be lost. So as the climate changes, what will happen to that plant and what will happen to that butterfly? Will they find new environments that are protected in order to continue living? The same is true with wetlands. There are many different types of wetlands in Pennsylvania, and these are on the basis of the different geologies and elevations in Pennsylvania. So we looked at those peatlands at a high elevation in an acidic environment, whereas you can have other areas in Pennsylvania where you have a limey kind of water available to form a wetland, and it produces an entirely different system. So I'm hoping you're getting the sense that in order for conservation of biodiversity, we need to really be paying attention to a lot of details. Species are not found just everywhere across the state. They're only found in certain areas. And certain of these stages, or what I'll now refer to as geophysical settings, they produce very rich ecosystems and rich arrays of plants and animals. And you don't find those just everywhere. You have to go specifically to some of those places. So now here's a geophysical settings map in Pennsylvania, and just kind of hang with me. We're almost done here. But these last kind of couple of concepts are really novel for conservation biology at this point. And this is where our thinking is going, is that based on the bedrock geology, which forms the soils, and based on the elevation for the most part, and with some tweaking to look at where the glaciers have come into Pennsylvania, you have these 35 different geophysical settings, and on these you get certain habitats, and certain species will utilize those habitats. Some species, the the American robin can be found broadly, but other species, if we're going to maintain our total portfolio of biodiversity, we have to go specifically to certain areas to find and protect and maintain those. And what you see is that in Pennsylvania, the protection that we've done has been largely at high elevations, and it's been in a certain type or a certain group of habitats that are not necessarily that rich in species, and certainly are not protecting, maintaining, harboring a lot of different ones. So the point here is that if you take the geophysical settings, and what we did was we took those 35 and we grouped them into 3 groups. And those groups are ones that are low elevation with a lot of limestone or shale in them and produce a lot of high biodiversity value, lots of species you don't find other places. And then on the other end of the scale, you can see here, it's represented in this map in the yellow, are different geologies. These are high elevation for the most part. They're for the most part sandstone geologies, and they have kind of a typical suite of species that are important, but what we found is that we've already protected quite a bit of those. So you can see if you group those 35 into 3 tiers, 1, 2, and 3, kind of the ones that are really rich but not very protected, compared to the ones that are less rich in species but more protected. This is the result that you can see. So you know, comparing, for example, here the tier 1, which are the highly diverse ones but not very protected, 28% of the state consists of these blue areas, and yet we've protected only about 9% of that. And most of our protection has been in this high elevation, mostly sandstone regions, where the state consists of about 48% of that, and we've protected, out of all of our protection on state land, it's been about 80%. So that's a message to think about, is that what we're saying here is that if we're going to protect biodiversity in the face of climate change, species are going to be forced to move. The climate's driving them out of their tolerance limits, and they need to move to other places. And will all of the species be able to find places to move that are protected and that will allow them to continue being part of the natural heritage that represents Pennsylvania? Thank you. Tom, I think I'm switching it back to you.
Yes, Charles, thank you very much for that nice presentation. It's always fascinating to me to hear the way you discuss these issues. You're so thoughtful about them. You know, the Conservancy continues to sort of drive forward in all its conservation work, as I said, land conservation, watershed work, threatened and rare species. But in all of that, it really is affected now by climate change, and we take it into account as we make our decision-making about what projects to do. Let's see, why don't I give people your email, Charles, if that's okay. I see that we had a few questions on Q&A, and I'm going to glance at that and see if they've all been answered. I believe they were. So if you have additional questions, feel free to just email Charles at cbier, B-I-E-R, at paconserve.org, and he or one of us will get back to you with answers. And I'd just like to thank you all for joining us, and Charles for that very nice presentation.
Thanks for your attendance.